Hello and welcome to the American Compass podcast. My name is Oren. I'm the chief economist here at American Compass. And today we are speaking with Jude Russo, managing editor at the American Conservative and author of a fantastic new feature at Commonplace, It's Not Too Late to Ban Online Sportsbook. That's right, the Super Bowl is coming up. You need to know who to pick against the spread, whether to take the over or the under, who to parlay with Travis Kelce to catch at least 2 touchdowns. And we are here to tell you, in fact, it is all awful. It is bad for the people doing it in many cases. It is certainly bad for the society. And ideally, we could do something about it. So Jude had a lot to say about this. Really interesting conversation. Let me tell you about what else we have at Commonplace first, though. I have a feature myself with Mark DePlacido, Compass Policy Advisor, called Big Stick Economics, looking at the importance of an industrial base and the reality that you can't have a defense industrial base without an industrial base and what that means for industrial policy and, frankly, a right-of-center coalition generally. I had some other great stuff, really liked a piece by Emil Doak this week on Catholic views on immigration restrictions. And Skylar Adleta, himself a construction project manager, on the value of taking up blue-collar work. We also had a really exciting announcement, Michael Lind officially joining Commonplace as our economics editor. So frankly, I can think of no one I would rather read than him on just about any topic, and we're delighted we'll have multiple pieces from him coming to you in the near future. And we've also announced a new hire at American Compass. Brad Littlejohn is coming on as our Director of Programs and Education. So look forward to more programs and more education from him. Last but not least, of course, Understanding America, coming to you as always on Mondays and on Fridays. If you are not subscribed, you missed out on, I think maybe our most read piece ever on the threat of tariffs on Canada and Mexico from the Trump administration. So you can go still find that and then subscribe at understandingamerica.co. But without further ado, here is Jude Russo. And Jude Russo, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me. Good to be here.
The Super Bowl is just days away. Our listeners are eagerly looking for your over-under, your pick against the spread, your three-way parlay. Where should we start?
Well, it's the Super Bowl actually is a great place to start because one of the many complaints about our current sports gambling regime is that, at least in the American context, it produces serious concerns about sports integrity, which Americans continue to care about. So if you are one of the Americans who are concerned about sports integrity, obviously you're going to take the Chiefs because the story is that the refs are in their pockets and that the league has, built up the Chiefs as this media brand. And that it's largely because the league is taking money from the sports books now. So I can expand at greater length if you'd like me to, but I don't know whether you have a list of things that you're looking.
No, well, there's just I'll have to give out my picks, I guess. We are taking the Eagles plus 1.5. We are take all the unders on the Travis Kelce parlays, and we'll check back next week on how I did there.
Okay.
But we are talking about this because you have a fantastic piece up for Commonplace this week. It's not too late to ban online sportsbook, which obviously dives into the middle of a conversation that I think, fortunately, is gaining steam quite rapidly. One of the nice things about the way that sports betting is rolling out nationwide is it is very quickly producing very high quality research on how terrible it is for people. But one of the interesting things, there are so many different cases that I think get made, and then so many different responses that they seem to implicate. Make yours. What do you think is the strongest argument against the direction we seem to be headed?
Well, I think that sort of the best way to go through it is the arguments advanced for sports gambling, which I think are sometimes made in good faith, sometimes made in bad faith, and then sort of exploding them or complicating them one by one. So the first argument that's always made is you're just being anti-fun. Gambling does not hurt anyone besides the gamblers. And that's just like their opinion, man. You are allowed to make bad choices in America, and that's part of the American genius. Um, and it's sort of just a personal choice, like any other vice consumption. And this is a particular form of the argument that you have whenever you're talking about vice regulation. It only, it's a victimless crime. Um, and as I talk a little bit in my piece, that's not entirely true. There are the sort of standard arguments that are advanced by anti-gambling groups that pertain to the addictive nature, and how the expansion of gambling interests gets more people addicted, and that this does actually have negative social consequences. So if you look at the annual report for the National Council on Problem Gambling, the comorbidities of various other social dysfunctions with gambling are extremely high. Drug use, alcoholism. Um, but this sort of doesn't debunk it's a victimless crime. It only affects gamblers. What does is when you start to look at the economic consequences. Bankruptcies, unsurprisingly, are highly correlated with problem gambling. People mortgage their houses, they take out tons of credit cards that they go on to never pay. And these, even though these are not socialized risks, they are distributed risks. When the bankruptcy rate goes up, I pay mortgage insurance, as I think most people who have a mortgage do. My rates go up when large numbers of people start defaulting on their mortgages. My credit rates go up when large numbers of people across the country are defaulting on credit cards. The market is a device in large part for distributing costs. And I do not get to consent to those costs. I am in some way a victim when we have large numbers of people who are being funneled into financial situations they can't handle. So that's sort of the first argument in favor of gambling deregulation, and the counter to it. It does, in fact, affect people and harm people who not only are not involved in the gambling, but are not even proximate to the gambler. The sort of second big argument in favor of gambling deregulation broadly is that it's an economic driver. It makes the dollar machine run. It gives jobs. Significantly, something that always shows up in pro-gambling op-eds is that it's a major contributor to state-level fiscs. You can tax it and take stuff in. This is a nice idea. Unfortunately, the nature of sportsbook is that it just doesn't employ that many people, first of all. You don't need tons of people to run what is basically a large spreadsheet operation. So if you look at FanDuel, which is one of the large sports books in the United States, Irish owned ultimately, as most of the online gambling operations are. They're mostly foreign owned. They employ 3,000 people, which is a pretty large internet company. But if you look at a casino that employs 7,000 people or 10,000 people, and they are the jobs that tends to be more valued by lawmakers, right? They're the blue collar jobs and service sector jobs. Programmers are going to get work anywhere. We're not really worried about keeping our programmers employed. And there is an opportunity cost with gambling, right? Gambling does not actually produce any goods. What you're being sold is the opportunity to lose your money. The only thing that gambling does in aggregate is make the people who participate in aggregate poorer, because the house needs to get paid no matter what. And those are dollars that are taken away from actually productive activity. which, if you are a really hard in the paint libertarian, may not be convincing. You may think that all economic activity is created equal. But I think that most people have a sense that it's better to, have your steak and peas rather than Coca-Cola. There are, in fact, differences between types of economic activity. And the third argument that's advanced is, well, people do it anyway. Lots of people gamble, even when it's not legal. So we may as well just legalize it and try to control the harms from it. Maybe make some money off of it at the government level. And this just isn't true. For people who are old enough to remember, there was an online poker mania in the early 2000s that just disappeared. And not a lot of people who were intimately involved in that world didn't really think about it that much. But the reason that it disappeared was the government passed a law saying if you are operating an illegal online poker operation, if you put money in the bank, you're violating the Wire Fraud Act, and we will put you in jail. So they passed this law. Year and a half later, the FBI arrests 11 CEOs of online poker companies, accuses them of wire fraud and money laundering, and puts them in jail. And for some reason, this tamps down on online poker operations in the United States.
That's shocking that would have that effect.
Right. So you can, in fact, regulate it. And we know this intuitively. There are tons and tons of things that happen online that are regulated. You can buy almost anything online, yes, but you really, really have to go out of your way to buy things that are outright illegal. So, as anyone knows who has ever tried to buy a firearm online, you have to go through a fairly serious process.
Well, and what I find wild about it is, there are all sorts of things that we've never tried to regulate, let's say, and you can have interesting arguments about whether that regulation would work or not. In this case, online sports betting generally was in fact regulated and banned until about 2 years ago. Like we have a very accessible case study in what that looks like, and we can compare it to what we have now, and it's not very hard to make judgments about that. This doesn't seem like an especially challenging problem.
Right. Well, and this is, I think, a disingenuous argument that's forwarded. You can't both say that. So something that from the harm reduction lobby, especially, you see is not actually going to increase the number of problem gamblers. It's just that people who do have problem gambling will be able to, seek help. You can regulate their activity to a degree, but the overall number of people who are betting in a bad way, in an addictive way, is not going to increase if you legalize sports gambling, which they are doing anyway by, offshore sites. However, there are ways, to gamble illegally. And enforcement over the past 10 years has not been hugely stringent because we've decided that we don't really like enforcing the law in America anymore. But this argument sits very uncomfortably with the claims that are forwarded often in the same places about how it's going to cause this explosion of economic activity. If your argument is that this economic activity is already occurring and it's not going to expand, legalizing it is not going to cause more people to get employed. It's just that they will no longer have to route their paychecks through, tax shelters, basically. Either you are if there is going to be an explosion of economic activity from legalizing an activity, that means that more people are going to be participating, or the same number of people are going to be participating at a greater degree. So I think that there's a certain internal tension, if not contradiction, to these arguments that you see about, well, you have to legalize sports gambling because people are already doing it. And also it's going to usher in this, fiscal golden age, which when you do it, it turns out does not actually happen. The numbers, when you look at tax revenues from states that legalize gambling, are appalling. But sort of a different story. So it is, it's enforceable, fairly easily enforceable. There's just very little political will for it right now.
Right.
Something like 70% of the American people think that sports gambling should be fine, should be legal.
So I'm struck by in this set of arguments I guess concerted refusal to put the harm to the gambler on the list. It seems like a pretty large concession to the libertarian frame that we have to think of an externality if we're going to regulate it. I'm curious whether you think that's sort of substantively true, or you see that just as politically the way that it's best approached.
So I certainly think it's politically the best way to approach it. The American people does just have a small L libertarian streak. And we tend to, at least since the 19th century, arguments that make, purely moral appeals, rather than your bothering other people type appeals, don't tend to float very well. I think there are a lot of interesting sort of historical dynamics that have pronounced this in the American people. So I think that is politically true. As far as the sort of substantive aspect to it, I'm not a hard-boiled Baptist. I don't think that there is anything actually inherently wrong with gambling. I think that it's it is a vice activity. You don't really get anything out of it. But I do think that there are sort of social uses for it in the way that when you look at the historical way that we've regulated and allowed gambling, that are interesting. The harm to the gambler himself, I think, is just, I think it's something that Americans don't care about that much. I think that Americans think if you do stupid things, if you play stupid games, you win stupid prizes. And I think that problem gambling has not yet become a widespread enough problem that people have these personal connections to a problem gambler. We may be moving in that direction. If you look at the number of people who have gambled in the past year, this is a poll question that Pew runs annually. Monotonic increase. More and more people are gambling. And if you take a country that, is sort of economically comparable to the United States and in some respects culturally comparable, the UK, which has had sports gambling legal for years and years and years, they've arrived at a fairly static population of gamblers. And it's about 40%. 40% of Britons are gambling, in an organized fashion within a 12-month period. And they have a much larger group of problem gamblers as a result. I think that it sits at around 4 or 5% when the NHS last ran the study. So, if that is, the plateau that we are looking at, 4% or 5% problem gamblers, that is actually a lot of people. If every person knows about 150 people, they're going to know a couple people who have serious gambling problems.
Out of curiosity, I don't know that there's a single definition of problem gambling, but how is it typically thought of or defined?
Fairly squishily, which is what happens when you let sociologists instead of economists run surveys. But But basically, it's like other addiction definitions where you look at the negative externalities. Do you keep doing it despite the fact that there are negative externalities? So the National Council on Problem Gambling, which is for better or worse you know, Maven organization for problem gambling in America, has a questionnaire where they say, I think that they divide it into sort of three sections where it's like it analyzes, negative emotional externalities. So, do you get anxious if you're not gambling? Do you get angry when you're watching sports games if you have money on them? Which is highly correlated with like domestic abuse. And then they ask you, do you gamble money you don't have? Do you have you taken on debt to fund your gambling? Have you hidden gambling costs from a loved one? So it's and I think that if you hit like 7 of these, you're considered somebody who has a problem and should seek help. So it's similar to the sorts of soft definitions of addiction that you see, like the AA questionnaire. If you hit a certain number of these, you should probably come to a meeting. I, privately, have reservations about doing things this way, because this is fairly clearly distinct from chemical addictions. Like, if you stop using heroin too quickly, you will die. If you stop using alcohol too quickly, you will die. And if you stop, betting on the ponies, you'll get really irritable. Doesn't seem necessarily to be the same type of thing qualitatively. But, the social scientists have decided that my concerns don't really count for that much. They've continued to use gambling addiction as the framework. So the obviously with gambling, because of the nature of the activity, it is the fiscal or financial, I should say, concerns that really bear weight, because that is sort of the primary social ill that's introduced through it.
Well, I guess that leaves, I mean, there's the one other category, and you sort of almost started with this, right when we kicked off on the kind of integrity of the game. What about just what gambling does to sports? Does that count for anything?
Well, yes, and this is something that is quite interesting. There ha so the I'm choosing my words carefully here. The unpopular commissioner of the NFL, Roger Goodell, took a very, very strong line against sports gambling until the 2017 Supreme Court case that legalized it nationally. He said it is going to introduce questions about officiating, it is going to introduce questions about point shaving, the structure of parlay bets is going to cause play level questions. To take one example, there was a parlay last year that trying to remember the exact construction, but one of the components was will the Ravens have 3 fumbles in this game? And you can see fairly clearly that that is a very discrete thing that a player does have control over. It's not necessarily something that's going to be catastrophic for your team. If you're, way ahead, you may be, and you are under pressure to fulfill the conditions of a parlay. You could say, all right, I'm going to do this. Much as, point shaving, if you're ahead, you can sort of try to hit the over or the under. So Goodell says all these things, and then it gets legalized, and he immediately says, well, the NFL is going to get our cut. And immediately he institutes this sort of code of conduct where football players are not allowed to bet on football games. They are allowed to do other sorts of sports betting, unlike baseball, which notionally, baseball is going to kick you out if you darken the door of a casino, if you, are betting on basketball or the horses or whatever. And within the first couple of years, you have this slew of players who are betting on NFL games, and they get suspended. Cal Ridley, who was on injured reserve, is betting on his own team, which is a bad look. So in the NFL, these sort of concerns have manifested in a fairly classic, we are worried these guys are cheating type way. And this mixes with the natural propensity of NFL fans to be suspicious of officiating and of there being, the referees promoting narratives through the season. So that's not great. People don't like that. In baseball, you obviously have a very high-profile issue of Shohei Ohtani floating his interpreters' bookie debts, including on games that he's playing in, because Ohtani is very good business. Major League Baseball kind of, pretends that nothing happened here. They fired the interpreter, and decided after an investigation that Ohtani had nothing to do with the gambling, and this all is fine. Baseball, however, the more interesting thing than the sort of straightforward concerns about cheating that you see in the NFL is that the way they officiate has actually changed. There's a very good article in The Athletic from a couple of years ago about how umpires now count errors differently on the field because sports books prefer clean plays, so that you can either basically if there is an error on a play where you have parlay action on it, for example, it's considered a scratch. Like nobody gets it, like money's refunded, nothing happens. They strongly prefer it to be a clean catch or a clean miss. The umpires have largely stopped calling errors. They just, call it a miss. And that changes the way the game is, analyzed. It changes sort of the ethos of the sport. Errors are something shameful and something that people are interested in talking about. So there are sports integrity concerns. The entire Major League Baseball corporation, as it exists, is a response to the White Sox throwing the World Series. First baseball commissioner is there basically to make sure that gambling interests don't seep back into baseball. And Americans do seem to really prefer sports to be clean. I think that the question is whether they prefer sports being clean on the one hand, on the other hand, their national propensity towards gambling. I mean, gambling is a part of the American way of life from the get-go. And the fact that increasingly there is discomfort with moral legislation. The American people, as they currently are configured, don't seem to like telling people you should be doing something better with your money than betting on sports.
Well, so that's a good segue. So what should the response be? I mean, what do you think is feasible and what's ideal?
Well, so as I said, I think that the concerns about application or enforcement rather are kind of specious. You could pass a law tomorrow and get it done. I think that it's not necessarily politically possible. There is still mass support for legalized sports gambling in America. Um, I do think that there have been a couple of pieces of legislation introduced. Um, I believe most recently by Rob Wyden to clamp down on the advertising. Uh, I think that that is probably an easy victory. Uh, People are quite comfortable still with keeping tobacco and alcohol advertisements within certain limited, ranges. In part because they understand that these things are seen by children. The only sort of the key to the American heart morally is to say, oh, this is going to hurt kids who can't like consent to this stuff. We're still pretty down on that. So I think that you can clamp down on the advertising, which does clamp down on the number of people who are getting involved in this stuff. I think that journalists have a large swath of virgin territory here. There is not tons of on-the-ground reporting about this. There's been some, and there has been more in the past year and a half or so. But there's a lot of aspects of it that have not been well reported. One of which is, for example, that the problem gambling help resources are all funded by the gambling lobby. Which I've spoken with those people. They're very kind. They're very sincere. But one does wonder whether they have a tendency to frame the gambling issue in a particular way because Bally's is a platinum level sponsor for the National Council on Problem Gambling. So I think that's interesting. I think that that's worth examining. I think also as states begin to see that this is not a fiscal bonanza. I mean, we didn't really get to talk about it, but the amount of revenue that gambling is bringing Maryland, where I live, is a rounding error. It's something like 0.4% of the education budget, which is a portion of the overall budget.
Right.
And this is partly because gambling lobbies wrote all the model legislation, which is another interesting story. But I think that as states begin to see that, this isn't actually making money, there will be more appetite at the state level, especially in states that have large land grant universities with big sports programs. There will be more appetite to reduce the footprint of gambling, make sure that it's staying, on the right side of sports integrity, make sure you don't have tons of college kids gambling, which is an increasing problem. If you look at the reporting on it, it's, young men between 17 and 25 who are really getting into this stuff. So I think that there are some incremental places where there are some incremental improvements that could be made, and there is the political will to make them. And that's just politics. You have to move the football down and increase the horizon of the possible as you're going along. So even though, as the headline you wrote for me said, it's not too late to ban sports gambling. It could still be done. I'm not sure that it's in the political cards.
All right. Well, is there any, I think from a political activism perspective, there are a lot of folks looking to focus more on the issue, both, elected officials, outside groups, and so forth. I thought the journalism point in particular was interesting. Is there any kind of particular focus that you think most needs emphasis or uncovering that is maybe least well understood right now?
Yeah, I think that an interesting angle. There was one article on this in the New York Times, I think 2 years ago, and nobody has revisited it, even though it seems to be a very rich topic, is how sportsbook legalization has really wiped out some of the smaller Native American tribes. I think that is interesting. I think that Indian Affairs does actually draw national interest, if only because it's novel. People don't really report on it. And I think that it's an interesting aspect of things because it points to the undergirding philosophies of how we used to regulate gambling, which is basically that you were giving somebody an economic rent. We allowed gambling for persons and groups that could not otherwise support a way of life. So in the case of the Indians, they're forced by treaty to stay on these reservations, which don't tend to be in places that get tons of natural traffic. They don't tend to be richly endowed with natural resources. And so the state said, we will give you an economic rent. We will allow you to run a slots parlor, which will drive traffic to you. And because nobody else around you will be allowed to do this. And that way you can sort of, support yourself on this place that we are making you stay. So I think that the Indian Affairs aspect is interesting. I think that the addiction aspect is also interesting. I think that is something where social scientists are probably as important as journalists, just because a lot of it is going to be, data-based. We need people to actually be running accurate surveys, and running surveys with good premises. But I do think that, individual stories of addiction tug the heartstrings. And I think that the operations of the gambling lobby in America are largely underreported. The American Gaming Association is this massive industry group. As I said, they wrote the model legislation that got adopted in a large number of states after sports gambling was legalized by the Supreme Court. And there's just very little scrutiny on them, what their interests are, what the different internal lobbies of the AGA are, and how they are devoting their resources to swaying politicians. So I'd say that those are sort of three things that come immediately to mind.
That's really interesting. All right. Well, we are counting on you to do some of that. You can publish it here at Commonplace. And we wish you the best of luck with all of your Super Bowl bets this weekend.
Thank you.
Jude Russo, thank you for joining us. And we will be back again soon with another episode of the American Compass Podcast.